Jane Smith sat in her small, cozy office at Hope Valley Hospital, staring at the glowing red numbers floating above her patient's head. Bob Green, a friendly mailman with 2 small kids, had exactly 47 days left to live. Her heart felt heavy as he happily talked about taking his children to Fun World Theme Park next summer. "Tommy is finally tall enough for the big coaster," Bob grinned, showing her pictures of his kids on his phone. Jane nodded and smiled, but inside she was hurting. She had seen these death countdown numbers above people's heads ever since the terrible car crash that killed her mom and dad when she was 12. That day changed everything. She survived the crash, but woke up with this strange power. 20 years had passed and Jane had learned to live with her ability. She became a doctor who helped people with their worries and fears, though she never told anyone when they would die. Only her younger sister Kate knew about her power. Sometimes Jane wondered if her gift was actually a curse, especially when she had to sit and listen to people like Bob talk about futures they would never see. After Bob left, Jane packed up her things to go home. She looked in the big mirror behind her door, something she did every day to check her own death date. But tonight was different. The red numbers that had always shown above her head, 23 years, 145 days, 7 hours, were gone. Just gone. She rubbed her eyes hard, thinking she must be tired, but the numbers didn't come back. Scared and confused, Jane grabbed her phone to call Kate. Just then, a strange notification popped up on her screen. Someone had booked an appointment for 3:33 in the morning, a time when the hospital was always closed. The patient's name made Jane's hands shake. Mary Walker. That was her mother's old name before she got married, and Jane hadn't heard it since the crash 20 years ago. Things got even stranger. Betty, the kind old cleaning lady who worked in the hallway, always had steady numbers above her head, showing she would live another 15 years. But now Jane watched in horror as Betty's numbers started jumping around wildly, like a broken clock, before stopping at a terrifying new time. Just 1 hour and 23 minutes left to live. Jane's phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from an unknown number. "The time has come. You are one of us now." Before she could process what this meant, another message came through. "Check the basement storage room, locker 333. With shaking hands, Jane called hospital security. "Ted, has anyone unusual come into the building today?" The guard's answer chilled her. "Funny you ask, Doc. A group of people in white coats came in claiming to be from something called the Timekeepers Institute. They went straight to the basement. Want me to check it out?" "No," Jane said quickly, perhaps too quickly. "I'll handle it." She knew she should leave, go home, and forget about all of this. But the numbers above Betty's head kept counting down, and Jane couldn't bear the thought of another death she could maybe prevent. Taking a deep breath, she headed for the basement stairs. The old fluorescent lights flickered as she descended, casting strange shadows. When she reached the storage area, she found locker 333 standing open. Inside was a single piece of paper with more red numbers, but these were different. They were moving, changing, like living things. And below them was a message that made her blood run cold. "Every gift has a price. You've been watching time. Now time is watching you." Just then, the basement door slammed shut with a heavy metal clang. The lights went out, plunging Jane into darkness. In the black void, red numbers began appearing all around her, floating in the air like fireflies. But these weren't death dates. They were something else entirely, and they were moving towards her. Her phone lit up one last time with a new message. "Welcome to Level 2, Jane. Your real training begins now." The red numbers surrounded Jane like a swarm of glowing fireflies, each set telling a different story. They weren't just death dates anymore. Some showed birth dates. Others revealed important moments in people's lives. As she stood frozen in the dark basement, she began to understand what was happening. She wasn't just seeing when people would die. She was seeing their entire timelines. A soft click echoed through the darkness, and a door she'd never noticed before creaked open. Warm light spilled out, and in the doorway stood an old man with kind eyes. Above his head, instead of numbers, there was a strange symbol that looked like an infinity sign. "I'm David," he said softly. "We've been waiting for you, Jane." He didn't look dangerous. He reminded her of her grandfather. But Jane stayed where she was, her back pressed against the cold wall. "Who's we?" she asked, her voice shaking. "The Timekeepers," David explained, stepping into the basement. "There are 12 of us. Well, 13 now, counting you. We're the ones who watch over time itself." He pointed to Betty's rapidly changing numbers that Jane could still see through the ceiling. "What's happening to her isn't random. Someone is trying to change her timeline, and that's why we need your help." Before Jane could respond, her phone rang. It was Ted, the security guard. "Doc, you better come quick. There's something wrong with Betty. She's collapsed in the hallway upstairs." Jane's heart jumped into her throat. The numbers above Betty's head had said 1 hour. It wasn't supposed to happen this fast. She raced upstairs with David following close behind. They found Betty unconscious on the floor, but what caught Jane's attention was the strange man standing over her. He wore a black coat, and above his head were backwards moving numbers, time flowing in reverse. "Time twisters," David whispered. "They try to change people's destinies for their own gain. Every time they succeed, it causes a ripple effect that damages the fabric of time itself." The man in black looked up, smiled coldly, and suddenly Betty's body began to fade, becoming transparent like a ghost. "He's erasing her from time," David shouted. "Quick, Jane, focus on Betty's timeline. You can see it now. Grab it, hold it in place." Jane didn't understand what he meant, but instinctively reached out toward the glowing numbers above Betty's head. To her amazement, she could feel them, like threads of light between her fingers. The time twister snarled and pulled back, creating a strange tug-of-war with Betty's timeline. In that moment, Jane saw flashes of Betty's life, her children, grandchildren, all the lives she would touch in her remaining years. With a surge of determination, Jane pulled hard on the glowing threads. There was a bright flash and Betty solidified again, gasping for air. The time twister stumbled backward, his own numbers flickering wildly. "This isn't over," he growled, and vanished into thin air, leaving behind a faint smell of burnt metal. As David helped Betty to her feet, Jane noticed something even more shocking. The numbers above her own head had returned, but they were different now. Instead of a death date, they showed a series of changing symbols she somehow understood. She was seeing her own timeline branching into multiple possible futures. "What's happening to me?" she whispered to David. He smiled gently. "You're evolving, Jane. The power you've had since the crash. It was just the beginning. That car accident 20 years ago? It wasn't an accident at all. Your parents were timekeepers too, and they died protecting you from the time twisters." Jane's phone buzzed again. Another appointment had appeared on her schedule, this time for multiple patients, all with her mother's maiden name, Mary Walker, and all scheduled for 3:33 a.m., but on different days. As she stared at the screen, David's voice turned grave. "They're coming back, Jane. All the people who were erased from time, and only you can see their numbers." 3. Jane's office felt different now, filled with swirling timelines she could finally see clearly. Each patient's life story floated around them like colorful ribbons of light. As she sat at her desk, staring at the list of Mary Walkers on her schedule, a young woman burst through her door. Above her head, the numbers were a chaotic mess. Past, present, and future all jumbled together. "Please, you have to help me," the woman cried. "I'm Alice. At least I think I am. I woke up this morning and my husband didn't know who I was. My kids were gone. My house belonged to someone else. It's like I've been erased." Jane glanced at David, who had been pretending to be her new office assistant. He nodded slightly. This was one of the erased ones they'd been waiting for. As Jane looked more closely at Alice's timeline, she saw the problem. There was a sharp break in her timeline, a point where everything went wrong. November 15th, 1999. "That's the day your parents died," David whispered to Jane. "The time twisters didn't just target your family. They erased dozens of timekeepers and their families that day. But something went wrong with the erasures. They weren't complete. That's why some people like Alice still remember their real lives." More people began showing up at Jane's office. A teacher whose students couldn't see him, a bus driver whose roots never existed, a grandmother whose grandchildren had never been born. Each one had a broken timeline, and each break connected back to that same day in 1999. As Jane helped each person, touching their timelines and trying to stabilize them, she noticed something strange. Every time she fixed someone's timeline, a new memory of her own parents emerged. She saw her mother teaching her to ride a bike, a memory she'd never had before. She remembered her father's laugh, a sound she'd thought was lost forever. But the time twisters weren't sitting idle. The man in the black coat appeared again, this time with others. They moved through the hospital like shadows, touching patients and staff, making their timelines flutter and fade. Ted, the security guard, called in a panic. People were disappearing from the security cameras, literally vanishing from the recorded footage. Then Jane saw it. The numbers above David's head changed. The infinity symbol flickered and transformed into a countdown. 12 hours. He was running out of time, too. "There's something you're not telling me," she said, confronting him in the empty waiting room. David sighed heavily. The time twisters. They're not trying to erase people from time. They're trying to collapse all of time into a single moment, and they need the power of erased timelines to do it. He pointed to the growing darkness outside the windows. Look carefully. Jane gasped. The stars were disappearing, not just being covered by clouds, actually disappearing from time itself, and in their place red numbers filled the sky, all counting down to the same moment. Her phone buzzed one final time. A new appointment had appeared. Patient, Jane Smith. Time, now. The name listed for the doctor was Mary Walker, her mother. The hospital corridors grew darker as more stars vanished from the sky. Jane's footsteps echoed as she ran towards room 333, where her appointment was scheduled. Her mind raced with questions about her mother, but David's countdown, now at 10 hours, kept her focused on the urgency of their situation. She pushed open the door to find the room transformed. Instead of the usual therapy furniture, the walls were covered in floating timelines, each one connected to the others like a giant glowing web. In the center stood a woman whose timeline Jane could not see at all, Mary Walker, her mother, looking exactly as she had 20 years ago. "My brave girl," Mary said softly. "We hid the truth to protect you, but now you need to know everything." She touched the wall, and suddenly the room filled with scenes from the past. Jane watched her parents and other timekeepers fighting against the time twisters, protecting the natural flow of time. "We weren't just watching death dates," Mary explained. "We were guarding the timeline, the connection between all moments in history." But something in the scenes caught Jane's eye. In each memory, there was a familiar face among the time twisters. Ted, the security guard. "He's been here the whole time," Jane whispered, "watching me." The hospital's emergency alarm suddenly blared to life. On Jane's phone, security footage showed people throughout the building beginning to fade away. Ted was moving from floor to floor, touching walls and doorways, causing ripples of erasure to spread like waves. "He's planting time bombs!" David shouted over the alarm. "Devices that erase chunks of time. If enough go off at once." "Everything collapses," Mary finished. She turned to Jane with desperate eyes. "The power you have, seeing and holding timelines, it's stronger than mine ever was. You can rewrite time itself, Jane, but it comes with a price." Before Mary could explain further, the door burst open. The man in the black coat stood there, but now Jane recognized him. Behind the cold smile and dark clothes was her father's face. "Hello, sweetheart," he said. "Did you really think that car crash was an accident? I chose to change sides that day, and now you'll have to choose too." The numbers above David's head suddenly accelerated, dropping from hours to minutes. Outside, more stars winked out of existence. Time itself was unraveling, and Jane stood in the middle, seeing all possible futures stretching before her like roads in every direction. But which one was right? Her phone lit up with one last message. "Some things are meant to be erased." It was from her mother, not the one standing in the room, but another version of her, from another timeline. And attached to the message was a video dated November 15th, 1999, the day everything changed. Jane's hands trembled as she played the video. The grainy footage showed a younger version of her father in a hospital room just like this one, surrounded by timekeepers. But what she saw next made her heart stop. Her father was creating time bombs, storing stolen time from sick children in the cancer ward. He wasn't just working with the time twisters, he had started them. "Every time we saved someone who was meant to die," her father explained, his voice colder than she remembered, "we stole time from someone else. Your mother couldn't accept that, but you're smarter than she was, aren't you, Jane?" The numbers above David's head now showed just 30 minutes. Through the windows, the sky had turned into a swirling mass of red digits. Down in the parking lot, cars were beginning to fade, their timelines dissolving into nothing. Betty burst into the room, her cleaning uniform covered in strange burn marks. "The basement!" she gasped. "Ted's rigged it with hundreds of time bombs. He's going to erase the whole hospital." Jane looked at her mother, or whatever version of her mother this was, who nodded slowly. "There's something else you need to see," Mary said, waving her hand. The air shimmered, and suddenly Jane saw something that made her stumble backward. Hundreds of transparent figures filled the hospital halls, ghostly shapes of people who had been erased. Among them were children, lots of them, all wearing hospital gowns. "The kids from the cancer ward," her father said proudly. "I didn't just steal their time, I stored it. Every child your mother saved over the years just had their time redirected to my collection. And now," he pulled out a small device that pulsed with red light. "Now I have enough stored time to remake reality itself." David fell to his knees, his timeline growing dim. "Jane, he whispered. Remember what I taught you about holding timelines? You can do more than that. You can weave them. The ghost children began moving toward Jane, their own timelines trailing behind them like broken strings. She could feel their lost time calling to her. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from the other Mary Walker. The power isn't in seeing the numbers. It's in seeing the spaces between them. Ted's voice came over the hospital speakers. Time bombs armed. Detonation in 10 minutes. Jane looked at her father with his stolen time. Her mother who might not be her mother. The dying David, the ghost children, and Betty clutching her burned arms. All their timelines stretched out before her like threads in a tapestry. And suddenly she understood what she had to do. She reached out not to grab the timelines this time, but to find the empty spaces between them. The moments that had never happened. The possibilities that had never been given a chance to exist. Dad, she said quietly, you forgot something about time. Her hands began to glow with a light that wasn't red but pure white. It's not just about when things end. It's about all the moments in between. Jane closed her eyes and began to weave. Not just the timelines she could see, but the spaces between them. The quiet Sunday mornings that never happened. The birthday parties that were erased. The first steps that faded away. Every lost moment began to glow like stars coming back to life. Her father lunged forward with the time storage device, but he froze mid-step. The ghost children moved closer, their transparent hands reaching out to touch the threads of their stolen time. Jane could feel everything now. Every laugh, every tear, every heartbeat that had been erased. The hospital walls seemed to breathe with memories. You can't rewrite everything, her father warned, his voice shaking for the first time. Some deaths are meant to happen. That's the natural order. But Jane wasn't trying to rewrite death. Instead, she began connecting timelines like pieces of a puzzle, the empty spaces in one filling the gaps in another. A ghost child's laughter joined with a grieving mother's timeline. A lost father's wisdom merged with an orphan's future. She wasn't changing when people died. She was restoring the moments they were meant to have. David's countdown slowed, then stopped completely. The white light from Jane's hands spread through the hospital like a gentle wave. In the basement, the time bombs began to disintegrate, turning into small piles of sand. Ted screamed as his own timeline suddenly became visible, a twisted, dark thing full of stolen moments. Then Jane saw something that made her pause, her own timeline, stretching back to the car crash, but now she could see what really happened that day. Her father hadn't caused the crash to join the time twisters. He'd been trying to stop them, and in his fight, he'd become trapped between moments, neither alive nor dead, slowly turning bitter as he watched time pass without him. Dad, she whispered, take my hand. I can bring you back, not to change what happened, but to live the moments you have left. The woman claiming to be her mother began to fade, revealing herself as just another time twister's trick. But as she disappeared, the real Mary Walker stepped out of the spaces between moments, her timeline bright and unbroken. The ghost children began to solidify, not returning to life, but finding peace as their stolen moments were returned to the world. Each of their timelines connected to someone else's future, their memories, their love, their wisdom living on in new ways. Above the hospital, stars began to reappear, not just the ones that had vanished, but new ones too, each one a moment restored to its rightful place in time. Jane's phone lit up one last time, showing a single appointment, life, time, ongoing. The hospital corridors hummed with restored time, but something was still wrong. As Jane held her father's hand, she noticed new numbers appearing on the walls, birth dates that hadn't happened yet, deaths that were centuries old. Time wasn't just healing, it was overflowing. The balance, David gasped, his strength returning slowly. When you restore time, you have to maintain the balance. He pointed to the growing chaos around them. In the maternity ward upstairs, babies were being born with timelines stretching thousands of years. In the emergency room, patients were aging and growing young again in random bursts. Betty, who had been quiet all this time, stepped forward. Her timeline now showed something impossible. She had always been here, in every moment of the hospital's history, watching, waiting. I'm the guardian, she said, her simple cleaning uniform transforming into flowing robes covered in shifting numbers. This place isn't just a hospital, it's a time anchor, keeping past and future in balance. Jane's restored father gripped her hand tighter. That's why they chose this place for the time bombs, he explained. Destroy a time anchor, and reality itself unwinds. He looked at his daughter with tears in his eyes. I tried to fight it, tried to save everyone, but you can't save them all without breaking time itself. Suddenly, every phone in the building lit up with the same message. Warning, time overflow critical. The restored moments were causing a flood, pushing time past its breaking point. Jane could feel it. Too many possibilities, too many restored lives, all trying to exist at once. Through the windows, they could see other hospitals in the city beginning to glow. More time anchors, all of them starting to crack under the pressure of restored time. Mary Walker, the real one, touched her daughter's shoulder. Sometimes, she said softly, healing means letting go. Jane looked at the ghost children, now solid but unstable, their timelines burning too bright. She looked at her father, trapped between saved and lost. She looked at David, his infinity symbol now a question mark, and she understood what she had to do next. I have to choose, she whispered. Not between saving and losing, but between holding on and letting time flow naturally. She turned to the ghost children with tears in her eyes. I can't give you back your lives, but I can give your moments meaning. Jane began to untangle the overflow of time, not by erasing moments, but by letting them find their natural place. The ghost children slowly faded, but this time their timelines wove into the hospital itself, their courage flowing into scared patients, their hope spreading through worried families, their laughter echoing in the children's ward. Her father's timeline was next. I understand now, he said, his form becoming less solid. We were so focused on saving time that we forgot to live it. His timeline split into thousands of thin threads, each one carrying a lesson, a memory, a moment of love into the world. He wasn't gone. He was becoming part of every story. Betty the Guardian raised her hands and the hospital walls turned transparent, showing time flowing like a river through the building. In every room, moments were finding their right place. A mother holding her newborn baby shared the joy of a ghost child's last smile. A recovering patient felt the strength of a lost father's determination. But in the basement, Ted was making one last desperate move. He had gathered all the time bomb sand into a pile, trying to rebuild something even worse. If I can't control time, he screamed, I'll shatter it completely. Jane looked at her mother, then at David and smiled. She finally understood her true power. It wasn't about seeing death dates or even fixing broken timelines. It was about accepting that every moment, whether happy or sad, long or short, was precious exactly as it was. She walked calmly to the basement, each step leaving footprints of soft white light. The other timekeepers followed, their timelines harmonizing with hers. Ted looked up, his face twisted with rage and fear. You don't understand, he snarled. Do you know how many people die unfairly? How many lives are cut short? I can fix it all. No, Jane said gently. You can only break it more. She held out her hand, not to fight, but to share what she could see. All the beauty in both the long lives and the short ones, the joy hidden even in moments of sadness, the connections that made every second meaningful. Ted's hands trembled as Jane showed him the truth. In his timeline, she could now see what drove him. His young daughter's death from cancer 20 years ago. He had joined hospital security to find a way to bring her back, making him an easy target for the time twister's promises. I just wanted more time with her, he whispered, tears streaming down his face. The pile of time bomb sand began to glow beneath his feet. Jane knelt beside him. Look closer, she said softly. Behind them, Betty waved her hand, and Ted's daughter appeared, not as a ghost, but as a memory made of pure light. She was laughing, playing in a hospital garden that used to exist. Her time wasn't stolen, Jane explained. It's still here, in every child who plays in that garden space, in every parent who finds strength during hard times, in every moment of kindness in this hospital. She touched the pile of sand, and it transformed into thousands of tiny stars, each one carrying a precious moment back to where it belonged. The hospital shimmered as time finally found its balance. Patients who had been fading snapped back into focus. The ghost children's timelines settled into the walls like gentle whispers of hope. Even the numbers above people's heads changed. They no longer showed just endings, but the beauty of each life in between. David's infinity symbol returned, but now Jane understood what it meant. He wasn't endless. He was part of the endless flow of time itself. Betty smiled and faded into the background, her guardian role hidden once again behind her cleaning uniform, watching and protecting the time anchor. Jane's mother touched her shoulder. It's time for us to go, she said. Other time anchors need protection and other time twisters are still out there. She looked at her daughter proudly. But you're needed here. This is your anchor now. Ted stood up, his timeline healed but changed. Let me help, he said. I can protect this place. Watch for signs of temporal damage. It won't bring her back, but maybe it can give her life more meaning. As the old timekeepers prepared to leave, Jane noticed one final change. The numbers she saw above people's heads weren't just birth and death dates anymore. Now she saw the moments that mattered most. First loves, great achievements, times of courage, and simple joys. She saw how each person's time touched countless others, creating an endless web of meaningful moments. 1 year later, Hope Valley Hospital looked the same on the surface, but Jane saw it differently now. Her therapy office had become a special place where people found not just healing, but meaning in their time. Ted worked night security with new purpose, his eyes watching for any disturbance in the hospital's temporal field. Betty still cleaned the halls, her guardian powers keeping the time anchor steady. The numbers above people's heads told deeper stories now. When a worried mother rushed in with a sick child, Jane could see not just their timelines, but the strength they would find together. When elderly patients faced their final days, she helped them see the beautiful ripples their lives had created. One quiet evening, as Jane was finishing her paperwork, a young girl walked into her office. Above her head was something Jane had never seen before, a timeline that bloomed like a flower, spreading joy to everyone it touched. "Are you the time doctor?" the girl asked. "The one who helps people find their missing moments?" Before Jane could answer, she noticed a familiar face in the waiting room. David. He hadn't aged a day, but his eyes carried the wisdom of countless moments. Next to him sat several people Jane recognized from old photographs, former timekeepers, each bearing the same infinity symbol. "There's been a development," David said seriously. "Other hospitals, other time anchors, are reporting strange patterns. People are starting to remember things that never happened, while forgetting things that did. The balance we created, it's shifting." Jane looked at the little girl, then back at David. On her desk, her phone lit up with a new appointment. Patient, time itself, doctor, all of us. She smiled, understanding that her journey wasn't ending, it was just beginning. The numbers above her own head had changed one final time. They no longer showed when she would die or even the important moments of her life. Instead, they showed a simple truth: every moment matters. "Tell me about these patterns," Jane said to David, as she took the little girl's hand. Outside her office window, the stars twinkled brightly, each one a moment waiting to tell its story. The hospital hummed quietly with the energy of countless interconnected lives, and somewhere in the halls, Betty smiled as she mopped the floor, guardian of time's endless dance.